quiet, unassuming suburb of Millbrook, where the streets were lined with manicured lawns and the hum of daily life was comforting in its predictability, secrets were hidden behind closed doors. Calvin Hartman appeared to have everything a man could want. He had built a life that many would envy: a devoted wife, Sophie, whom he had loved since they were teenagers, and one of the most beautiful houses in their town. Their home was warm, filled with laughter, and rooted in the stability that came from years of trust and shared memories. Calvin worked as a graphic designer while Sophie taught art at the local high school. They had crafted a life that felt safe, solid, and unshakable. But beneath the surface, buried under layers of routine and normalcy, Calvin harbored a dark secret. This secret began to take root the day his younger brother Noah came back into their lives. It all started innocently enough. Calvin welcomed Noah in after a messy breakup. He never suspected. Noah was always the charismatic one, the wild one. He brought with him attention that Calvin couldn't quite explain. The easy camaraderie between brothers soon became something else, something forbidden. What started as glances and touches quickly escalated into a dangerous game. Calvin was drawn to Noah in ways that terrified him and threatened to destroy the life he had. Calvin built guilt with Sophie. He felt guilty about it, but he also felt a thrill and intense feelings for Noah. Each encounter and stolen moment pushed him further toward the edge until he found himself trapped in a web of desire, guilt, and obsession. Neither brother could escape it. It all started on a cold night in November when his younger brother, Noah, moved back to town. Noah had always been different from Calvin. Calvin was steady and responsible, while Noah was impulsive. He was a free spirit, having spent years moving from one city to another. He never stayed in one place long enough to settle down. They hadn't been close as adults, but Calvin had always admired Noah's independent streak. When Noah called out of the blue asking if he could crash with Calvin and Sophie for a while after a nasty breakup, Calvin didn't hesitate. He invited his brother to stay, eager for the chance to reunite, to offer Noah the stability he'd been missing. Noah arrived one stormy evening, soaked from head to toe, but flashing that same charismatic grin Calvin had known all his life from the moment he stepped into the house. The atmosphere changed. Noah had that effect on people: his charm, his easy laughter, his effortless way of fitting in. Sophie was instantly smitten with him, laughing at his jokes and insisting he stay as long as he needed for a while. Everything seemed fine. No help around the house. He started cooking dinner a few nights a week and even started joining Calvin on his morning runs. It was nice to have him around. Calvin thought it was like having a piece of their childhood back, a reminder of simpler times when they didn't have to worry about careers and mortgages and the endless responsibilities of adult life. But something began to shift between them. It was slow and almost imperceptible at first. It started with the looks Noah would catch Calvin's eye at odd moments, holding his gaze a beat too long. There was something in his expression that Calvin couldn't quite read. It unsettled him, though he didn't understand why at first. He brushed it off, telling himself he was imagining things. After all, Noah was his brother. There was no reason to feel uneasy around him. But the feeling persisted. It wasn't long before the touches began. They were casual, fleeting touches. A hand on the shoulder, a brush of fingers against Calvin's arm. But they lingered, sending an unfamiliar thrill through him. Calvin tried to ignore the way his body felt, but the sensation stayed with him long after the moment had passed. Noah seemed to be everywhere all at once. He joined Calvin in the living room after Sophie went to bed. They sat closer than necessary, their knees touching as they watched late-night TV. Calvin found reasons to be near Noah, small excuses to spend time alone with him. They ran errands together, worked on the backyard, even just sat in silence at the kitchen table, sharing a beer as the world outside Calvin felt the pull, but he didn't know what to do with it. He loved Sophie and their life together, but Noah had awakened something in him. It was something that terrified and excited him in equal measure. He found himself looking forward to the moments they were alone. His heart raced at the possibility of what might happen next. The turning point came one humid summer evening. Sophie was at a friend's birthday dinner, and Noah and Calvin were left to their own devices. They decided to crack open a bottle of whiskey and sit on the porch watching the fireflies flicker in the distance. The night was thick with tension. Calvin could feel it in the air between them. He could feel Noah's leg brushing against his under the table. He could feel Noah's gaze linger on his mouth when he spoke. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional clink of glass as they drank. Then Noah broke the silence. They opened a bottle of whiskey and sat on the porch watching the fireflies flicker in the distance. The night was thick with tension. Calvin could feel it in the air between them. He could feel Noah's leg brushing against his under the table. He could feel Noah's gaze linger on his mouth when he spoke. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional clink of glass as they drank. Then Noah broke the silence. He asked, "Do you ever? I wonder what it would have been like if we were closer." Noah's voice was soft and tentative, but there was a weight behind his words that made Calvin's pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Calvin asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Noah leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Calvin's. "I don't know, just if things had been different, if we hadn't drifted apart when you got married." Calvin didn't know what he had thought about it, of course. In those late-night moments when his mind wandered, he'd always push those thoughts aside, telling himself they didn't mean anything. They were just fleeting moments of nostalgia, not something real. "Things change. That's just life," Calvin said, trying to keep his voice steady. Noah wasn't letting it go. He leaned forward, his face inches from Calvin's. Now his breath warm against Calvin's cheek, he said, "I'm not talking about Calvin, I'm talking about us." The words sent a jolt through Calvin's body. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He felt frozen in place as Noah's hand slid over his. It was a slow, deliberate movement that made every hair on the back of Calvin's neck stand on end. Calvin didn't pull away. He couldn't. He wanted to. He knew he should, but something inside him wouldn't let him. Instead, he sat there staring at Noah, feeling that the electric charge between them grew stronger with every passing second. Noah and Calvin whispered to each other, their voices barely audible. Noah's eyes were dark and intense as he leaned in closer, his lips brushing against Calvin's ear. Calvin swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. He did feel it, the pull, the need, the obsession that had been growing inside him since the day Noah had walked back into his life. He hated himself for it. "What are you talking about?" Calvin lied. His voice was shaky. Noah pulled back slightly, studying Calvin's face. "Don't lie to me," he said softly. "I can see it in your eyes. You want this as much as I do." Calvin opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. He couldn't deny it anymore. He didn't want it. He wanted Noah in a way he had never wanted anyone else before, not even Sophie. That realization terrified him, but instead of running away, instead of pulling away, Calvin leaned into the desire, letting it consume him. He closed the distance between them, his lips finding Noah in a desperate, frantic kiss. It was messy, awkward, and nothing like the passionate, romantic moments he had shared with Sophie. But it was real, raw, and full of need. Each stolen moment felt like a fire burning under his skin. They couldn't keep their hands off each other and couldn't stop seeking out the next secret encounter. Calvin would catch himself lying awake at night, Sophie asleep beside him. His thoughts were racing back to the taste of Noah's lips and the way his brother's body felt pressed against his. He was terrified at how easily he was drawn into Noah's orbit and how much he craved him. There was a gnawing sense of guilt at the edges of his mind, but it was overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of what they shared. It was a high he couldn't give up, no matter the cost. In that moment, Calvin knew he had crossed a line he could never come back from. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises. Calvin and Noah found excuses to be alone together, sneaking around behind Sophie's back. Their affair grew more intense with each passing day. They kissed in the shadows and touched in the dark, always careful not to get caught, but never able to resist the pull between them. Calvin became obsessed. He couldn't stop thinking about Noah and couldn't stop craving. The next time they would be together, it was like a drug. He knew it was destroying him, but he couldn't quit. Every time they were apart, Calvin felt the ache of it, the emptiness that only Noah could fill. Sophie was oblivious to the growing tension between the brothers. She still laughed at Noah's jokes and teased Calvin about spending so much time with his brother. But Calvin knew it was only a matter of time before she realized what was happening. Before everything came crashing down, Calvin was in too deep. He couldn't stop. The weight of his obsession threatened to crush him. He was in too far. He couldn't turn back now. Some twisted part of him didn't want to. Calvin's obsession with Noah had consumed him entirely. Days blurred together as the lines between right and wrong, brotherly love, and something much darker became indistinguishable. His every thought was tangled with Noah. His laugh, the way he moved, the way he looked, the way he... Noah's presence filled the room even when he wasn't there. He seemed to understand the hold he had over Calvin. He played on it, toyed with it. He wasn't cruel, exactly, but there was a carelessness to the way he navigated their relationship that only deepened Calvin's need. Noah would disappear for days, sometimes returning with no explanation. His clothes were always a mess, and he'd brought strangers home with him. But the moment he walked through the door, flashing that easy, irresistible grin, all of Calvin's needs were met. Calvin's anger melted away, replaced by a burning desire for Noah. As the weeks passed, Noah's hold over Calvin tightened. Calvin became consumed by thoughts of Noah when he was at work, barely able to concentrate on his projects. His productivity plummeted, and his boss noticed the shift in his focus. She dropped subtle hints that Calvin needed to get his head back in the game. But how could he? His mind was a battlefield, and Noah was winning every fight. Calvin couldn't even look at Sophie without she felt a pang of guilt, but she smiled at him and touched his arm lovingly. He thought about how wrong it all was. He didn't deserve her. He had betrayed her in the worst way possible. But the thought of stopping what he had with Noah felt even worse. Calvin wasn't sleeping much anymore. He would lie in bed next to Sophie, listening to her gentle breathing. His mind raced with thoughts of Noah. He wondered where Noah was, who he was with, and what he was doing. Every moment spent apart from him was torture. Calvin couldn't fill the gnawing emptiness with anything else. When Sophie finally drifted off to sleep, he would sneak out of the house and sit in the living room, staring at the dark, waiting for the sound of Noah's footsteps on the porch. One night, after days of not hearing from Noah, Calvin found himself pacing the kitchen with his phone in hand. He had already texted Noah 3 times asking where he was, but there had been no response. Noah's response caused Calvin's heart to race with a mixture of panic and frustration. He was filled with a sense of urgency, questioning where Noah was and why he was ignoring him. The sound of the front door creaking open stopped Calvin in his tracks. He turned sharply, his heart pounding in his chest as Noah stepped into the dimly lit room. Noah's clothes were disheveled, his hair tousled from the wind. Calvin demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "Where the hell have you been?" Noah simply shrugged, not bothering to take off his jacket as he wandered over to the fridges out. He replied simply, pulling a beer from the shelf and twisting off the cap with a lazy flick of his wrist. "That's all you need to say." Calvin could feel the anger rising in his chest, a dangerous heat building behind his words. He had been going crazy with worry, and Noah's casual indifference was pushing him over the edge. "You're acting like a jealous girlfriend." Calvin flinched at the comment. The words cut deeper than Noah likely intended, but that was the problem. He was jealous. Noah was everything to him, and the thought of losing him even for a moment was unbearable. "I haven't heard from you in days," Noah said. His voice was quieter now, though still tinged with desperation. "You just disappear without saying a word, and I don't know what to do. You can't keep doing this." This made Noah raise an eyebrow, as if he found Calvin's concern amusing. "Why does it matter so much where I go? You've got your wife. You've got your life." Calvin stepped closer, his pulse quickening. "You know why it matters," he said. Noah's expression softened, and he set the beer down on the counter, his gaze flicking over. He reached out, placing a hand on Calvin's arm, and his touch sent a familiar shiver down Calvin's spine. "You're too attached, Noah," he murmured, his voice low. "This thing we have isn't meant to be forever." Calvin recoiled, as if he had been slapped. How could Noah say that after everything we've been through? His mind raced. Thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger and hurt. He'd given everything for Noah. He'd risked everything, and now Noah was acting as if it had meant nothing. That's not true. You can feel it too. I know you can. Noah's eyes flickered with something unreadable. For a moment, Calvin thought he might say something to reassure him or tell him that he wasn't alone in this. Instead, Noah pulled his hand away and shrugged again. "You're overthinking it," he said. His tone was distant. "Just relax." Calvin stared at him, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Noah had always been elusive and hard to pin down, but this was different. It was as if he was slipping away, and no matter how hard Calvin tried to hold on, Noah was already halfway out the door. Panic gripped Calvin's chest as he realized the truth. He was losing Noah. He had been losing him for a while now, but he hadn't wanted to see it. The nights spent apart, the unanswered texts, the casual indifference, it was all leading to this moment. Noah was pulling away, and Calvin was powerless to stop it. He grabbed his beer and walked toward the living room, as if the conversation was over. But Calvin couldn't let it go. He followed him, his heart racing, his mind spiraling with thoughts he couldn't control. "I can't lose you," Calvin blurted out, his voice breaking. Noah paused, turning to face him. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe pity, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You're not losing me," Noah said calmly. "You just need to—" Calvin felt he had to back off, but he couldn't. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Noah. He had already lost control of so much his life with Sophie, his sense of self. Now Noah was the only thing he had left. He needed him more than anything else. The room felt smaller, the air thick with tension. Calvin's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. He could feel the anger rising again. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with tension. Calvin's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. He didn't understand how much Calvin had sacrificed, how much he had given before Calvin realized what he was doing. He had closed the distance between them, his hand grabbing Noah's arm and holding on tighter than he meant to. "Noah, don't leave," Calvin whispered, his voice desperate and pleading. Noah frowned, pulling his arm free from Calvin's grasp. "Calvin, you need to calm down. This isn't—" His mind was racing. The edges of his thoughts were fraying as panic and obsession took over. He couldn't hear the warning in Noah's voice or see the cracks forming in the fragile balance they had created. All he could feel was the desperation rising in his chest and the fear of losing Noah overpowering any sense of reason. Noah had been pulling away little by little, and Calvin couldn't stand it. Every moment they weren't together felt like torture, like something vital. He was being ripped from him. He had to stop it. He had to keep Noah close no matter what. His mind was filled with paranoid thoughts. What if Noah left for good? What if he found someone else? The fear consumed him, blinding him to everything else. Noah couldn't leave. He couldn't without thinking. Calvin grabbed Noah again, this time harder. His grip tightened, his fingers digging into Noah's skin. "Noah, I'm serious," Calvin said. His voice rose in desperation. "You can't go." "You know I can't," Noah replied. Calvin released his arm again, this time more forcefully. "Let go of me," he said, but Calvin didn't let go. His mind was racing. His thoughts were a blur of anger and fear. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All he knew was that he couldn't let Noah leave. He couldn't lose him. In one swift motion, Calvin shoved Noah back. The force of the push sent him stumbling into the coffee table. Noah grunted in surprise, but before he could, Calvin grabbed Noah's shirt and pulled him close. "I'm not losing you," he growled. Noah's eyes widened in shock as he struggled against Calvin's grip. Calvin was stronger, fueled by a twisted mix of rage and desperation. His vision blurred, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger and need. He couldn't let Noah go. The struggle escalated, and in the chaos, Calvin's hand found the bottle on the table. He didn't realize what he was doing. He brought it down hard against the side of Noah's head. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the room. Then there was a sickening thud as Noah crumpled to the floor. Calvin froze. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared down at his brother. Noah lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes were wide with shock. For a moment, everything was the room was suddenly silent, and Calvin felt like it was closing in on him. The walls seemed to press in, and the air felt thick and suffocating. He couldn't move or breathe. All he could do was stare at Noah's lifeless body and feel the weight of what he had done crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "Noah," Calvin whispered, his voice barely audible. It was too late. Calvin's body trembled as he knelt beside Noah's limp form. His hands were slick with sweat. He could see the shards of broken glass scattered around them. In the dim light, the glass shone with a bloody sheen, and it seemed to twist something deep inside him. The silence was overwhelming, punctuated only by the refrigerator hum and the soft rasp of Calvin's breathing. For a moment, Calvin was frozen, his breath shallow as he stared at Noah's still body. He could hear only the pounding of his heart, and the room seemed to spin around him. This wasn't real. He reached out a shaking hand and brushed Noah's cheek, but the skin was already cooling under his touch. Calvin gasped, the horror of what he had done hitting him like a wave. His brother was dead. He had killed him. Panic clawed at his throat as he staggered back. His chest was rising and falling with his racing heart. How had it come to this? He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He hadn't meant to lose control, but now there was no going back. He went back to Noah and whispered again, but there was no answer or movement. The reality of what he had done hit him with a bang, knocking the breath from his lungs. His brother was dead. The bottle had hit Noah so hard that there was no coming back. Calvin had gone too far. He had never thought he would cross that line, and now there was no going back. His stomach churned, and bile rose in his throat. He stumbled back, crashing into the coffee table. He doubled over. He tried to gag, but nothing came up. His mind was filled with panic. He hadn't meant for it to happen. He just wanted to stop Noah from leaving. He wanted to keep him close and hold on to that intoxicating connection they shared. But now there was only emptiness. Calvin blinked through the haze of disbelief and stared down at Noah's still body. The once confident, magnetic figure was now reduced to a broken, bloody shell. The weight of Calvin's obsession settled heavily on his chest. His world had collapsed into this act of violence. He wanted to move, run, scream, but he couldn't. His legs were frozen, locked in place by the horror of what he had done. All he could do was sit there, staring at the blood-soaked floor. His mind was spiraling with the enormity of his crime. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke through the silence. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. She had been sleeping this whole time. If she came downstairs, she would see Calvin. He muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his shaking hands on his pants, smearing blood across the fabric. He needed to think, to act. He couldn't let Sophie see this. She couldn't know what had happened. She couldn't know the truth about him and Noah. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that would help him. His mind was racing with possibilities, but none of them seemed right. The walls felt like they were closing in, and his vision blurred with panic. Upstairs, Sophie's footsteps grew louder. She was awake now, probably wondering where he was and why he wasn't in bed beside her. She would come looking for him any minute. Calvin's pulse pounded in his ears as he bent down, grabbed Noah's arms, and dragged his brother's body toward the back door. His movements were frantic and clumsy. Calvin's breath came in short, ragged bursts. The blood left a trail across the floor, a dark red smear that seemed to pulse with life, mocking him. The back door creaked open as Calvin pulled Noah's body outside into the cool night air. His mind screamed at him to stop, to think, but he couldn't. He had to hide this, had to get rid of the evidence before Sophie, Calvin, or anyone else found out. The sound of her voice froze him in place. Calvin's breath caught in his throat. Calvin and Noah turned slowly to see Sophie standing in the doorway. She looked confused. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. Her voice was groggy with sleep. "Is everything okay?" Calvin swallowed hard. He was trying to think of an answer that would make sense. His hands were bloody, and he was trying to hide Noah's body from her view. But it was too late. Her gaze shifted downward, and the color drained from her face as she took in the scene in front of her was shocking. "Calvin, what is this?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and growing horror. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, choked with fear and guilt. He could see the pieces clicking into place in Sophie's mind, the blood, the body, the guilt in his eyes. She knew. Oh my God, oh. Calvin reached out to her, desperate to explain and beg for forgiveness. But she recoiled from his touch, her eyes wide with terror. Stay away from me, she hissed, backing further into the house. Sophie, wait, Calvin pleaded, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. That's not what you think, she replied, her voice trembling as well. I didn't mean to. You killed him. Calvin's mind was racing as he tried to find the right words. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Noah was gone, and there was no coming back from that. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. But Sophie wasn't listening. She turned and bolted back into the house, her footsteps pounding up the stairs. As she fled from him, Calvin stood frozen for a moment. His body trembled with the weight of his actions. He wanted to go after her and beg for forgiveness, but he knew it was useless. She would never look at him the same way again. She would never understand what had driven him to this point. As the dawn broke over the quiet suburban streets, the once peaceful home of Calvin and Sophie stood silent. Its walls harbored the dark secret that would soon unravel. In the days that followed, the news of Noah's death and Calvin's role in it spread like wildfire. The image of Calvin, the quiet, dependable husband, was shattered. He was replaced by a man consumed by obsession, trapped by forbidden desires that ultimately led him to kill the one person he claimed to love the most. The small town where Calvin and Noah grew up became a breeding ground for whispered rumors and speculation. Neighbors who had once waved to Calvin as he mowed the lawn now spoke in hushed tones. Now everyone was talking about what really happened that night. People were curious and wanted to know more. They were having late-night conversations behind closed doors. Everyone had their own theory. Some people thought that Noah was to blame for leading Calvin astray. Others questioned how long the obsession had been festering beneath the surface of Calvin's seemingly perfect life. Sophie, who was now a widow in every sense, disappeared from the public eye. She left the house they had shared for so many years. They had shared many memories inside its walls. They had laughed together, loved each other, and built a life together there. The house was tainted by the violence that unfolded there. A few months later, it was put up for sale. The new owners were unaware of the tragedy that had taken place within its walls. The story of Calvin and Noah was buried with the sale, but the weight of the truth lingered in the air like a ghost. The town was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that even the most stable lives can hide deep, dark secrets from the outside world. Calvin had it. He had it all: a loving wife, a good job, and a close family. But beneath that polished surface, his obsession had festered unchecked until it consumed him entirely, leaving destruction in its wake. As time passed, the name Calvin became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unchecked desires can spiral into something deadly. Friends who once admired him now avoided speaking of him altogether, and the tragic story of Noah's death became a dark legend that hung over the town like a storm cloud, never fully fading from memory.